Mr. Nader?
Ralph Nader is here. This is his niece. And Nan, her brother. Here.
Nun, can you hold the picture and I'll just move out of the way?
This is also her brother.
You've been handing out buttons today, sir. Tell us, should this plane ever fly again?
There should be a consumer boycott of this plane. It's inherently unstable, which is escaping the attention of the House and Senate committees. The basic problem is in their rush to market, the Boeing marketeers overruled the Boeing engineers, and they allowed larger engines placed in different ways that overloaded an ancient fuselage designed in the 1960s. That increased the MAX's prone to stall, and they tried to fix it with a software MCAS. You don't fix a hardware defect with a flawed, complex software fix. In the 737-300, the FAA required Boeing to alter the frame. They didn't do it in this situation. And Congress is responsible completely. Congress has cut the FAA budget, they've cut the FAA authority, they've allowed Boeing to regulate the FAA instead of the reverse. And here they are standing here, focusing on the MCAS instead of the fundamental design defect that's going to launch 5,000 MAXs, carrying hundreds of millions of people in the future. Notice, there hasn't been, in 1 year, there hasn't been a single comprehensive bill introduced to reauthorize and refund the FAA. What does that tell you? This is a kabuki show. It's a kabuki theater here. Nobody's really serious. Does anybody think in Congress that there's going to be legislation that's going to regulate Boeing? Boeing gives campaign contributions to 330 members of Congress, including a majority of this committee. And the airlines give freebies that are denied ordinary mortals like airline passengers, such as reservation fee exemptions, free upgrades. There's a corrupt situation here with the airlines and the aircraft manufacturers, and so everybody focuses on the FAA. Now, Elwell and Bahraini should resign. They allowed this to happen, they encouraged this to happen, but their defense is that the 2018 FAA Authorization Act forced them to increase the abdication of regulatory authority to Boeing to certify itself. So the problem's right here on Capitol Hill. 535 men and women who put their shoes on just like we do every morning. And the focus has got to be on the aerodynamic instability design. Who pointed that out? Captain Sullenberger in his testimony on page 2. Go look at it. He said that's what led to the need for the MCAS. That's what led to the need for the software, which has its own criminal negligence context involving Boeing and the FAA. This is a situation of criminal negligence at the least of what's going on here.
2 days, 2 hearings. Will this change anything in your opinion?
It'll inform the public because of you. The media's done an extraordinary job reporting on the 737 MAX, and I don't praise the media very often, but you got to give credit where credit is due. But don't think these people are going to actually push for legislation. Even the leading champion of reauthorizing the regulatory authority of the FAA, Senator Richard Blumenthal, still has not gotten a single Republican on the Senate committee to co-sponsor it. So it hasn't been introduced yet. This is a year after the disaster in Indonesia and over 6 months after the disaster in Ethiopia. So I think the media's got to become much more probing and much more skeptical and not be drawn into the quicksand of the complexities of the MCAS. By the way, a software fix cannot envision all the configurations. It cannot force the nose down 23 times the way it did in Indonesia. You can force it down once or twice. But it's a very flawed fix. It's not good human systems engineering. You have to design for the pilots, as the board, the NTSB said. You have to design the plane for pilots who are in a startled position and may not react as the spreadsheet artists at Boeing think they're supposed to react.
In all your years of consumer advocacy, how does this matter compare?
Well, I wrote a book called Collision Course in 1994, where I gave voice to very considered criticisms of the FAA. It's gotten much worse. The FAA has been stripped of its authority, stripped of its political backing, stripped of its budget, and stripped of its mission, in effect. Boeing now regulates the FAA.
Do you think there's any practical case to completely bring delegation in-house into the FAA? They say they don't have the technical staff or the resources to do it.
Well, they should. The aerospace industry is huge, isn't it? So when Alwell says to the Senate in testimony weeks ago, why it's going to take 10,000 more people and 1.8 billion more a year, my answer is, well, so what? You've got $1 trillion industry here affecting the lives of hundreds of thousands of people every day. And you're worried about 1.8 billion? The Pentagon swallows that in a day.
Any other questions for Mr. Nader? Thank
What do
you.
you make of the documents that Boeing has apparently withheld?
They have withheld all the aerodynamic tests and data regarding the alteration of the MAX, that is the larger engines, in order to compete with the Airbus 320neo for fuel efficiency, changed the center of gravity and increased the prone to stall. And they did that to get the market. It was the Boeing marketeers overruling the Boeing engineers. That's what happened. And they have not released that information. But even worse, do you think any of the Senate committee and the House committee is going to subpoena it? They don't use a subpoena. If these committees do not use a subpoena, forget about it. It's not going to happen. There's not going to be legislation. There's not going to be correction. We rely on the Justice Department criminal probe, which nobody knows how far up the chain of command in Boeing it's going, because the grand jury proceedings are secret. But this is clearly a situation for a consumer boycott. People should not fly this plane if it's ungrounded. We have an axe the max button here. The one thing that Boeing can't control, they can control the politicians here, they can control the FAA, they cannot control millions of air travelers who damage the brand. They can't control damaging the brand. In fact, Edelman Associates has been working on changing the brand. They're trying to figure out how to do it so Boeing isn't held responsible for it and have the airlines do it. They want to eliminate the brand, the MAX, for all the reasons we know. So when people call up for reservations, if this plane is ever ungrounded, they ought to say to Southwest and United and Delta and American Airlines, what's the equipment? And they'll get the message. The airlines will get the message. The brand has to be destroyed in order to raise the concerns of the airlines themselves. And the pilots' unions ought to allow more free speech. Some of them have been talking up very properly, the pilots, but they ought to allow more free speech, because a lot of them are scared. A lot of them are scared that if there's another crash, the pilots are going to be blamed.